Have you ever heard of a war where birds were the enemy? Sounds absurd, doesn't it? But it happened. Welcome to the Great Emu War. An event so peculiar it's hard to believe it's a part of our world history. Picture this. The year is 1932. The world is in the throes of the Great Depression, and Australia is not immune. The Australian economy, heavily reliant on its agricultural sector, is in a state of turmoil. Farmers, many of whom are veterans of the First World War, are struggling. A combination of drought and plummeting wheat prices has left them in dire straits. The situation is desperate, and something needs to change. Enter the emus. These large, flightless birds, native to Australia, have a breeding cycle that coincides with the Australian wheat harvest. Following their breeding season, they typically migrate from the coastal regions to the inland areas. In 1932, this migration led them directly into the Western Australian wheat belt, right where the farmers were struggling the most. They arrived in their thousands, a formidable army of beady-eyed, feathered invaders descending upon the farms and causing widespread destruction. The emus, in their quest for food and water, began to ravage the already suffering wheat crops. The farmers, understandably, were not pleased. They saw their livelihoods being destroyed by these feathered intruders. They needed help, and they turned to the Australian government. But how does a nation wage war against a bird? Well, as it turns out, with machine guns and soldiers. And so, it was against this backdrop of economic distress that our feathered friends became foes. A strange war was about to unfold, a war not against another nation, but against a force of nature. A war that would go down in history for its sheer absurdity. The Great Emu War. Stay with us as we delve into this peculiar chapter of history where man and bird became unlikely adversaries. Imagine, if you will, a horde of 20,000 emus descending upon your fields. Picture the scene. A cloud of dust on the horizon growing larger with each passing moment. Then, out of the haze, a flood of feathers and beady eyes. This was not some Hitchcockian nightmare, but a reality for the farmers of Western Australia in the early 1930s. The emus, typically residents of Australia's vast inland regions, found themselves driven towards the coast. A combination of drought and overpopulation had left their usual habitats barren, and the emus were in search of food and water. And where better to find such necessities than the fertile farming lands of the coast? With an uncanny sense of direction, the emus descended upon these lands. And let's not forget, these were no small birds. Standing at up to 6 feet tall and weighing as much as 40 kilograms, emus are formidable creatures. In their search for sustenance, they wreaked havoc. Crops painstakingly cultivated by the struggling farmers were trampled underfoot. Acres of wheat fields were reduced to wasteland. The farmers, already dealing with the hardships of the Great Depression, watched helplessly as their livelihoods were decimated. Let's pause for a moment and consider the sheer scale of this destruction. 20,000 emus, each consuming up to 3.5 kilograms of food a day. That's 70,000 kilograms of crops, disappearing down the gullets of these feathered invaders daily. And it wasn't just the crops that suffered. Fences were toppled, allowing other pests access to the ravaged fields. This was an invasion, a relentless onslaught that seemed unstoppable. The farmers, in their desperation, knew they needed help. They had tried everything, scarecrows, fences, even driving the emus away, but nothing worked. This was a force of nature, a storm of feathers and hunger that could not be reasoned with or deterred. Faced with an emu onslaught, the desperate farmers turned to the military for help. And so, the stage was set for one of the most peculiar conflicts in history, the Great Emu War. And so, the Australian military, armed with machine guns, were dispatched to wage war against emus. Yes, you heard it right. This wasn't your typical battlefield. There were no trenches, no tanks, no enemy soldiers. Instead, there were emus. Thousands of them, and they were causing havoc on the farmlands of Western Australia. The military's initial plan was simple. Find the emus, line them up, and let the machine guns do their job. But as they soon discovered, emus are not as cooperative as one might hope. Deploying their forces on the 2nd of November, 1932, the soldiers quickly realized that these birds were not only fast, but also surprisingly resilient. Their first encounter with the emus was a disaster! They found a mob of around 50 emus and opened fire. However, the birds scattered in all directions, using their speed to evade the bullets. The soldiers were left staring in disbelief as the emus disappeared into the distance, unscathed. Undeterred, the military tried again and again. They attempted to herd the emus into tight groups to increase the effectiveness of their firepower. But the emus, with their keen senses and speedy reactions, outmaneuvered the soldiers at every turn. The birds seemed to understand the danger and kept their distance from the guns. As the days wore on, the soldiers' frustration grew. The emus were proving to be elusive and tough adversaries. Despite their best efforts, the military could not achieve the quick victory they had expected. The emus, with their surprising resilience and speed, were winning the battle. In the end, out of the thousands of emus that were targeted, only a few hundred were reported to have been killed. The soldiers, equipped with their machine guns, were left scratching their heads, wondering how a bunch of birds had managed to evade them so effectively. But the emus proved to be formidable adversaries, evading the military's attempts to bring them down. This was the Great Emu War of Australia, a comical yet poignant reminder of the unpredictability of nature and the challenges it can present. Now you might think this is where the military would claim victory, but the emus had other plans. The emus, it seems, were not as simple-minded as initially thought. Rather than grouping together like traditional military targets, the emus began to scatter, creating a dispersed battlefield that proved difficult for the soldiers to manage. Their guerrilla warfare tactics, if we can call them that, were surprisingly effective. As the soldiers attempted to line up their shots, the emus would scatter in all directions, leaving the soldiers firing at thin air. The emus, with their superior speed and agility, were proving to be a formidable enemy. It was as if they were playing a game of chess, and the soldiers were always one step behind. The military's efforts were beginning to seem futile. The number of emus culled was far below expectations, and ammunition was being wasted at an alarming rate. The emus, on the other hand, were thriving. Their numbers seemed unaffected, and their spirit unbroken. This turn of events did not go unnoticed by the public. People began to question the government's decision to wage war on these seemingly harmless creatures. The media, ever the watchdog of society, started to criticize the operation, dubbing it a farce and a waste of resources. The war had turned into a public relations disaster for the government. The soldiers, who were once hailed as heroes, were now being mocked for their inability to defeat a flock of birds. The government, faced with mounting criticism and public outrage, had to make a decision. They could either continue with the operation, risking further humiliation, or they could admit defeat and call off the operation. The public sentiment was clear. The people were not in favor of this war. They wanted it to end. And so, the government, in a move that surprised no one, decided to call off the operation. It was a humiliating defeat, but a necessary one. The emus had won the war, not through force, but through their sheer will to survive. With public opinion turning against them, the government finally called off the operation. So, who won the Great Emu War? Well, that depends on who you ask. In the aftermath of the war, the battle-scarred Australian fields were still plagued by the emus. The soldiers had withdrawn, the guns were silenced. But the emus, they were still there, unperturbed, continuing their march across the land, oblivious to the human desperation they had left in their wake. The farmers, the original victims of this unusual war, were left to continue their struggle alone. As the dust of the Great Emu War settled, the Australian government was forced to reassess their strategy. The military intervention had proven ineffective and rather expensive, so they decided to implement a new approach, a bounty system. This system incentivized the local population to hunt down the emus. For each emu killed, a bounty was claimed. It was a more gradual method, but over time it proved to be quite efficient in controlling the emu population. But the emus, the unlikely protagonists of this tale, had already left their mark. The Great Emu War had become a unique and humorous footnote in Australian history, and indeed in world history. A war where the enemy was not another nation, not a terrorist group, but a flock of large, flightless birds. It was a war that highlighted the unpredictability of nature and the resilience of the emus. The legacy of the Great Emu War lives on, not just in history books or YouTube videos, but in the collective memory of the Australian people. It serves to remind us of the time when man, armed with all his technology and military might, was humbled by a force of nature. The emus didn't fight this war, they didn't even know a war was being fought. But they survived, they persisted, and in doing so, they triumphed. And that is why when asked who won the Great Emu War, some might just say it was the emus. And so, the Great Emu War serves as a reminder that sometimes, the greatest battles come from the most unexpected adversaries.